The August sun hammered down on Fort Wexler like a judge's gavel, turning the tarmac into a shimmering lake of heat that made the air taste like metal and diesel. Staff Sergeant Elena Reeves stepped off the shuttle bus, her boots finding purchase on asphalt that had seen 3 decades of military vehicles grind their authority into its surface. The sound of her footsteps, steady, measured, unhurried, was swallowed by the distant thunder of morning PT cadence drifting across the compound. Sound off, 1, 2. She'd heard that rhythm in a dozen different languages across 3 continents. It was the heartbeat of military life, constant and unyielding. But here at Wexler, it carried a different weight. This wasn't just another Army base. This was where the branches came to prove themselves, where Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Raiders, and Air Force PJs rotated through joint training exercises designed to answer one question. Who's the best? Elena knew the answer. She'd always known. The best were the ones who survived long enough to stop asking. The base looked exactly as she remembered from 20 years ago, back when she was 15, and her world had collapsed in the span of 7 seconds. Same guard towers, same concrete hangars, same smell of jet fuel and gun oil and testosterone-fueled competition. The only thing different was her. She'd been a child then, watching her father's casket draped in an American flag. Now she was something else entirely. Something the men at this base weren't ready for. The armory sat at the eastern edge of the compound, a squat concrete building that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed aesthetics were a sign of weakness. Elena pushed through the heavy steel door into the familiar cool darkness, her eyes adjusting to the fluorescent lighting that hummed overhead with the persistence of trapped insects. 4 men in navy blue combat shirts clustered behind the wire mesh counter. Their conversation stopped the moment she entered, replaced by something worse than hostility: amusement. Lieutenant Marcus Kane noticed her first. He was 29, built like a recruiting poster, with the kind of blonde hair and sharp features that suggested generations of military breeding. His pale eyes tracked her movement across the room with the casual assessment of a predator who'd already decided she wasn't a threat. "Well, well," Kane announced to his companions, his voice carrying that particular brand of condescension that comes from never having been truly tested. "Look what the Army sent us." The others turned. Chief Aaron Webb, 39, weathered and solid, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen actual combat instead of just talking about it. Petty Officer Liam Cross, 27, Montana raised and Montana proud, with hands that looked like they could crush walnuts. And Corporal Tyler Brooks, 25, fresh-faced but trying hard not to be bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet like a boxer waiting for the bell. "Hope she knows which end of the rifle the bullets come out of," King continued, and the others chuckled with the easy camaraderie of men who'd run together as a unit long enough to finish each other's sentences. Elena didn't bite. She'd heard variations of this conversation in Kandahar, in Baghdad, in places that didn't have names on any map the Pentagon would acknowledge. She signed for her M4 with a practiced signature, pulled it across the counter, and started her inspection routine. Chamber check, sight alignment, sling adjustment. Her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that came from handling weapons in places where a malfunction meant more than just failing an exercise. "Easy there, killer," Webb called from behind her, his tone suggesting he was doing her a favor by offering guidance. "Those training rounds won't hurt anyone unless you point them the right way." Brooks snorted, the sound sharp in the confined space. "I heard she's more of a PowerPoint warrior than trigger puller anyway. Bet she hasn't seen real action since the Bush administration." He paused for effect. "The first one." The others laughed, that particular masculine laughter that said they'd scored a point in a game only they were playing. Elena finished her weapon check and slung the rifle across her chest without acknowledging them. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before Kane filled it. "You know, Sergeant," he said, dragging out her rank like it was a joke they were all in on, "we're happy to show you how things work around here. No shame in asking for help. We've all got to start somewhere." She turned to face him, then her expression revealing nothing. Up close, Kane's confidence was even more pronounced. This was a man who'd spent his entire adult life being told he was exceptional, who'd never encountered a challenge his training and genetics couldn't overcome. The kind of man who confused entitlement with earned authority. "Guess we'll find out," Elena said simply, her voice flat and professional. She walked toward the briefing room, leaving them behind. As the armory door swung shut, she heard Kane's voice drop to what he probably thought was a whisper. $20 says she folds the first time someone gets aggressive. Elena kept walking. She'd been underestimated by better men than these four. It never lasted long. The smart play was to let them think whatever made them comfortable. Reality had a way of correcting misconceptions, usually at the worst possible moment for the people who held them. The briefing room had been a storage hangar in a previous life, all concrete floors and metal rafters with folding tables shoved against the walls to make room for rows of uncomfortable chairs. A whiteboard dominated one wall covered in hand-drawn diagrams that represented the day's training scenario, urban breach, and clear exercise staged in one of Wexler's warehouse mock-ups. Elena chose a seat in the second row, positioning herself where she could see both the instructor and keep track of the room's dynamics. Around her, small clusters of trainees segregated themselves by branch. You could read the tribal affiliations in their posture, their patches the way they held their weapons, like totems of their particular religion. The four SEALs had claimed a row near the back, sprawled in their chairs like they were holding court. Kane's boots were propped up on the chair in front of him, and he was explaining something to the others in the tone of voice that suggested they should feel privileged to receive his wisdom. Major Billings entered precisely on time, lean gray-haired with the kind of authoritative presence that made conversation die without him saying a word. He was old-school military, the kind who believed in discipline and protocol and the chain of command, especially when it was inconvenient. "Gentlemen," he began, then caught himself with visible effort. "And Sergeant Reeves, welcome to today's joint training exercise." He outlined the parameters with military precision. 4-person assault team, timed breach and clear, simunition rounds that hurt enough to demand respect but wouldn't leave permanent damage. Standard protocol run 1,000 times across 100 bases. Elena took notes, her mind already mapping the scenario. She'd run variations of this drill countless times in training and in places where the targets shot back with real bullets and real malice. The fundamentals never changed. Speed, surprise, violence of action. The holy trinity of close-quarters combat. But halfway through Billings's briefing, Kane raised his hand with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to redirecting conversations to suit his purposes. "Sir," he said, his tone respectful enough on the surface but carrying an undertone that suggested he was about to improve everyone's day with his brilliant insight. "I have a concern about today's exercise structure." Billings stopped mid-sentence and fixed Kane with a stare that could have frozen boiling water. "What kind of concern, Lieutenant?" Kane leaned forward, his body language suggesting earnest professionalism. "Well, sir, we have Sergeant Reeves here to evaluate our training program, correct, to assess how we conduct close-quarters combat exercises and provide feedback to Pentagon brass." "That's correct," Billings said carefully, sensing the trap being laid, but not yet seeing its shape. "Then with all due respect, sir, how can the sergeant properly evaluate our performance if she's just standing on the sidelines? That's like asking a restaurant critic to rate a meal by watching other people eat." Kane spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable logic. "If she wants to understand how we operate under pressure, she should be part of the team. Experience it firsthand. Otherwise, any evaluation she provides is just theory." The room had gone quiet. 50 pairs of eyes swiveled between Kane and Elena, sensing blood in the water. Webb nodded sagely from his position behind Kane. "The lieutenant makes a valid point, sir. We don't need someone standing outside the wire telling us how to do our jobs. If Sergeant Reeves is confident in her ability to evaluate SEAL-level training, she should be confident enough to participate." Cross joined in his voice, carrying false concern. "Besides, sir, if we can't keep one unarmed observer safe during a training exercise, that says something about our capabilities, doesn't it?" Brooks completed the ambush, his young face earnest and helpful. "We'll make sure she doesn't get hurt, sir. We're professionals." Elena sat perfectly still. Her expression revealed nothing while her mind calculated angles and possibilities. This wasn't about training. This was about 4 men who'd decided her quiet competence was somehow a challenge to their authority. They were manufacturing a situation designed to embarrass her, to prove she didn't belong, to send her back to whatever desk job they assumed she'd crawled out from. The beauty of it was the framing. If she refused, she'd look cowardly in front of 50 witnesses. If she agreed, they'd have home field advantage in a scenario they controlled. This isn't how the scenario is designed, Elena said evenly, her voice cutting through the tension without raising in volume. This is a timed breach drill, not a hand-to-hand combat exercise. Different objectives, different skill sets. Kane's grin widened, showing too many teeth. Exactly, Sergeant. So if you can still contribute meaningfully to a team without weapons, that proves something important about combat effectiveness, doesn't it? Adaptability under adverse conditions. Isn't that what real operators need to demonstrate? Billings looked uncomfortable. He'd clearly dealt with these SEALs before and knew their reputation for pushing boundaries. The kind of men who confused arrogance with confidence and thought rules were suggestions for lesser people. Look, he said finally, his voice carrying the weariness of a man tired of political games but trapped by military hierarchy. We'll try it for the first run. If there are problems, we'll adjust. He turned to Elena, apology evident in his eyes. Sergeant Reeves, surrender your weapons. You're going in unarmed. The order cut through the room like a blade. Refusing would make her look insubordinate in front of 50 witnesses. Complying would let these four jackasses think they'd scored a victory. Either choice came with a price, and the currency was her credibility. Elena stood slowly. The room watched as she lifted her M4, walked it to the front table, and set it down with deliberate precision. Not slamming it, not making a show, just making it clear this wasn't submission. Her sidearm followed, leaving her holster empty and her options significantly reduced. When she returned to her seat, the SEALs were grinning like they'd just won the lottery. Cross made a show of whispering something to Brooks that set them both chuckling. Across the room, a couple of younger soldiers exchanged glances that clearly said she was about to get destroyed. Billings finished the briefing with mechanical efficiency, dismissed everyone to the staging area. As chairs scraped against concrete and bodies moved toward the exit, Kane passed close enough to Elena's shoulder to murmur just loud enough for her to hear, "Hope you've been doing your yoga, Sergeant. You're going to need all the flexibility you can get." She didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. But as she fell into step toward the warehouse, her mind was already shifting gears, cataloging joint locks, pressure points, the dozen ways to turn an opponent's weapons against them. If they wanted to see how she handled herself without a rifle, she'd give them a demonstration they'd never forget. The walk to the warehouse took them across an open stretch of tarmac that shimmered with heat waves despite the early hour. The building itself was a steel cathedral, all corrugated metal and harsh angles designed for function rather than form. Temporary plywood walls had been erected inside to create a maze of corridors and blind corners, the kind of layout that punished hesitation and rewarded decisive action. Elena stood in the staging area outside the tape-marked entrance, feeling the weight of eyes from the observation deck above. Word had spread through the base's gossip network faster than a brush fire in dry grass. The Army advisor was going in unarmed against 4 Navy SEALs. The deck was packed with spectators, some genuinely curious, others hoping to see a train wreck. Kane, Webb, Cross, and Brooks moved through their pre-mission routine with the casual confidence of men who believed the outcome was already determined. Kane slapped his magazine home with unnecessary force, the metallic click echoing through the space like a period at the end of a sentence. Webb rolled his shoulders, working out kinks that weren't there. Cross and Brooks exchanged fist bumps like they were heading to a party instead of a training exercise. "Try to keep up in there, Sergeant," Webb called over his shoulder, his tone suggesting he was doing her a favor by offering encouragement. "Wouldn't want you to get lost before the fun starts." Brooks snorted, the sound carrying across the staging area. "Should we leave breadcrumbs? In case she needs to find her way back out?" The laughter that followed was sharp and exclusive, the kind that drew lines between insiders and everyone else. Elena knelt at the edge of the staging mat, adjusting her gloves with methodical precision. She didn't respond to the taunt, didn't even look up. Her attention was focused on details these 4 hadn't bothered to notice. The way the lighting created blind spots in certain corners, how the plywood walls would flex slightly under pressure, the fact that their gear made distinct sounds when they moved Kane's magazine, rattling in its pouch, Webb's radio, clicking against his plate, Carrier Cross's knife scraping against his belt buckle, Brooks's nervous energy translating into the squeak of new boots. Without weapons, she was theoretically at a massive disadvantage. But theory was just theory, comfortable and clean, and completely divorced from the chaos of actual combat. Every piece of equipment these men carried was a potential tool in the right hands. Every moment of overconfidence was an opening. Every assumption about her helplessness was ammunition she could use against them. Major Billings's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, flat and professional. Team Alpha stack at the entry point. Scenario begins on my whistle. Objective is the green crate in the center room. 3 minutes on the clock. The SEALs formed their entry formation with textbook precision. Kane on point, Webb second, Cross third, Brooks bringing up the rear. Elena found herself positioned 5 paces behind the stack, close enough to technically be part of the team, but far enough back to be an afterthought once they hit the door. Up on the observation deck, she caught fragments of whispered conversation voices carrying in the still air. 79 seconds. She'll be lucky to last half that. 4 against 1 and she's got nothing. This is going to be ugly. Kane's been waiting for something like this, teaching these affirmative action hires a lesson. Elena settled into a balanced stance, her breathing slow and controlled. She'd been in rooms like this before, only the walls had been stone instead of plywood, and the consequences had been measured in body bags instead of bruised egos. She knew exactly how quickly the dynamic could shift when violence became the only language anyone understood. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The whistle shrieked through the warehouse like a starting gun. The SEALs surged forward in perfect synchronization. Or so they thought. Kane took point, his rifle up and ready, sweeping left and right with mechanical precision. Webb stayed tight on his shoulder. Cross just behind, Brooks anchoring the rear and already thinking about what they'd say in the debrief about how easy it had been. Elena didn't follow directly behind them. Instead, she angled off to her left, using the wall for cover, while cutting toward the first choke point before they had even cleared the entrance. She moved like smoke, like water, finding the path of least resistance. The spectators leaned forward on the deck, sensing that whatever was about to happen wouldn't be the routine beatdown they'd expected. The first quarter was barely wide enough for 2 people to move abreast. Kane took point, his rifle up and ready, sweeping left and right with mechanical precision. Webb stayed tight on his shoulder. Cross just behind, Brooks anchoring the rear. His attention focused forward on the objective, already mentally preparing for the next phase of the exercise. 20 seconds in, they reached the first turn, a sharp left into what the exercise called an urban alley. Brooks swung around the corner without checking his 6, his attention focused forward on the objective. It was the kind of tactical error that got people killed in real combat. But in training, it just got you embarrassed. Elena slipped in behind him like smoke, her movements flowing with the kind of lethal grace that came from years of close-quarters training in places where hesitation meant death. Her left hand clamped over his rifle barrel while her right locked onto his wrist with precise pressure. Not enough to break bone, but more than enough to control his entire arm. A sharp twist against his shoulder joint sent lightning up his arm. A quick pull to break his balance and override his center of gravity, and Brooks went down hard onto the padded floor with a grunt of surprise and pain that echoed off the warehouse walls. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a strangled wheeze. Before he could recover, before he could even process what had happened, she stripped the rifle from his grip like taking candy from a child and stepped over his prone form with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. 32 seconds. Cross heard the commotion and spun around, his eyes widening when he saw her holding Brooks's weapon. He tried to bring his own rifle to bear, muscle memory taking over, but she was already inside his guard. She used the captured weapon like a lever to hook behind his knee, a sharp sweep, and his legs were gone. He hit the deck with a thud that resonated through the plywood floor. She dropped her knee onto his sternum, just enough pressure to pin him without causing permanent damage, and used her free hand to apply a blood choke. Cross tapped frantically against the mat, officially out of the scenario. She shoved his rifle back at him and moved on without a word. 45 seconds. Kane was beginning to understand that something had gone catastrophically wrong with his brilliant plan. He wheeled toward her, trying to bring his weapon up in the narrow confines of the corridor. But the space that had been designed to favor the assault team now worked against him. His rifle became a liability instead of an asset, too long and unwieldy in the compressed environment. Elena stepped to her right, letting his momentum carry him forward. Her left foot hooked behind his ankle, while her shoulder drove into his ribs. Physics did the rest. Kane went sideways into the padded wall with a bone-jarring impact that knocked the wind out of him. The rifle slipped from his grasp. She caught it before it hit the ground, spun it into a control position, and had it aimed at his center mass before he could draw his next breath. He froze his face, cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been respect. 62 seconds. That left Webb. The chief had heard enough of the chaos behind him to know that brute force was his only remaining option. He came around the corner fast and low, his arms spread wide for a tackling embrace that would have worked against most opponents. But Elena wasn't most opponents. Instead of fighting against his momentum, she dropped her center of gravity and used his own force against him. Her hands found purchase on his sleeve and forearm, and with a sharp pivot that drew on years of close-quarters training, she threw her hip across his line of attack. Webb went airborne for a split second that probably felt like an eternity, then crashed onto his back with enough force to rattle his teeth. Before he could recover, she'd stripped his sidearm, racked the slide in one smooth motion, and had it aimed at his chest from less than 3 feet away. 79 seconds. The whistle blew again, sharp and final. Silence fell over the warehouse like a blanket of snow, muffling everything, making the world feel smaller and more intimate. The only sounds were the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the ragged breathing of 4 men who just discovered the difference between confidence and competence. Elena straightened slowly, handed the training pistol back to Webb, gripped first, and stepped away from the carnage she'd created. Her breathing was barely elevated, no sweat on her forehead, no triumphant smile, just professional calm, as if she'd done nothing more remarkable than complete a routine equipment check. From the observation deck, a ripple of voices spread through the crowd like wildfire through dry grass. Some were muttering in disbelief, others chuckling in the way people do when they've witnessed something that defies their understanding of how the world works. How did you see that move where 4 guys, man, 4 of them? One recruit leaned over to his buddy and whispered with barely contained awe, his voice carrying in the stunned silence. She just destroyed all 4 of them in under 90 seconds, with her bare hands. Kane struggled to his feet first, rubbing his shoulder where it had made intimate acquaintance with the wall. His face was flushed, whether from physical exertion or embarrassment was hard to say. Brooks remained on one knee, adjusting his gear like it might restore some of his dignity. Cross avoided eye contact with everyone, suddenly fascinated by his bootlaces. Webb stayed seated on the floor for several long seconds, as if standing up would make his defeat more real. Elena said nothing. She didn't gloat, didn't lecture, didn't even look particularly satisfied. She just walked to the gear rack, hung up the borrowed equipment, and removed her gloves with the same methodical precision she'd shown throughout the exercise. The timer above the entrance still glowed in accusatory red digits. 1:19. Behind her, the SEALs struggled to salvage what remained of their dignity. Kane muttered something about lucky shots and unfair advantages, but his heart wasn't in it. Cross busied himself with equipment that didn't need adjustment. Brooks looked like he was having a serious conversation with his career choices. No one apologized. No one acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, they'd misjudged the situation from the beginning. That's when the slow clap started. It echoed through the warehouse with deliberate precision, not mocking but commanding attention in a way that made everyone look up toward the observation deck. A tall figure in dress greens leaned against the railing, his silver eagles catching the fluorescent light like small suns. General Frank Dutton descended the metal stairs with the kind of presence that made grown men stand straighter without being told. He was 68 years old, broad-shouldered, distinguished in the way that came from decades of command. His eyes missed nothing and judged everything, but there was warmth there too, buried beneath layers of military discipline. He stopped a few feet from Elena, studying her with something that might have been amusement. When he spoke, his voice carried across the warehouse like a sermon from a pulpit. Didn't expect to see Sparrow back on the mats. The call sign hit the room like a physical blow. Kane's head snapped up. Webb went absolutely still. Cross and Brooks exchanged glances that said they just realized they were in much deeper trouble than they'd thought. Sparrow wasn't a nickname you earned teaching basic training. That was a designation that came from places where failure meant body bags and success was measured in missions that never made the news. Elena's expression didn't change. "Been a while, sir," Dutton nodded toward the 4 men still picking themselves up off the floor. "Gentlemen, you might be interested to know that Staff Sergeant Reeves here served as primary close-quarters combat instructor for a joint NATO task force, specialized in neutralizing multiple armed opponents in confined spaces. That was what, 8 years ago? 10, Elena corrected quietly. 10 years. Dutton repeated, his smile growing slightly, which means she was perfecting techniques like what you just experienced, while some of you were still learning which end of the rifle to hold. In fact, Chief Webb, his gaze shifted to the man still sitting on the floor. I believe you may have unknowingly incorporated several of her original training protocols into your current curriculum. The transformation in the SEAL's posture was immediate and complete. Kane's arrogance evaporated like morning mist. Brooks suddenly found the floor fascinating. Cross swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a fishing cork. Dutton took a step closer to Elena, his voice carrying enough to reach every corner of the warehouse. Good to have you back, Sergeant. This base needs more instructors who can still demonstrate why their techniques work. Thank you, sir, she replied, her tone professional, but carrying an edge that suggested she was done being underestimated. The general turned back toward the four men, his expression hardening. As for you gentlemen, I think a lesson in humility is overdue. You'll clean every mat in this facility, and you'll do it properly. This isn't just about tactical skills. It's about respect for your fellow warriors. Respect you failed to demonstrate today. The order landed without argument or protest. Webb nodded curtly. Kane managed a clipped, "Yes, sir," that sounded like it was pulled from his throat with pliers. Cross and Brooks snapped to attention, their faces pale. Dutton left as deliberately as he'd arrived, his boots ringing against the concrete in a rhythm that underlined the fact that the demonstration was over and normal operations would resume. But nothing would be quite the same. Not for those four men, not for the spectators who'd witnessed what happened, not for anyone who'd been in that warehouse when theory collided with reality and reality won in 79 seconds. Elena didn't linger to savor her victory. She collected her gear, secured her empty holsters, and headed for the exit. A few of the younger recruits stepped aside as she passed, their expressions carrying something they hadn't shown her before. Not just curiosity, but genuine respect. The kind that had to be earned, never given. Up on the observation deck, one instructor leaned toward another and murmured, his voice carrying just far enough. 79 seconds against four armed commandos. Hell of a way to make a point. Elena kept walking, her pace steady and unhurried. This hadn't been about proving anything to anyone. It had been about doing the job she'd been asked to do, even when the parameters changed without warning. The fact that four arrogant men had learned something in the process was just a bonus. Behind her, the sound of mops and cleaning supplies being distributed echoed through the warehouse. It wasn't the most severe punishment in military history, but everyone who'd spent time in uniform understood the sting of being put on janitorial duty after getting shown up in front of an audience. The August sun was climbing toward its peak when Elena finally made it back to her temporary quarters. Her body didn't ache, the encounter had been too brief and too one-sided for that. But her mind was already moving ahead to what came next. Those four SEALs weren't going to accept this lying down. Men like that never did. Pride was a powerful motivator, especially when it had been wounded in public. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, unlaced her boots with practiced efficiency, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. 20 years ago, she'd been a 15-year-old girl watching Marines load her father's casket onto a transport plane. Captain James Reeves killed in action during the First Battle of Fallujah, one of dozens who died in those brutal house-to-house fights that had turned the city into a meat grinder. She'd been there, not in Fallujah itself, but at the forward operating base where families had been temporarily housed, waiting to be shipped back to the States. When the insurgents had launched their surprise attack on the base, she'd watched Major Frank Dutton, younger than leaner, still carrying the invincibility of a man who'd survived Desert Storm, try to protect her mother and the other families. Her father had taught her to shoot. Weekends at the range, patient instruction, safety protocols drilled into her until they were instinct. When the shooting started, when Dutton went down with a leg wound and her mother was screaming, Elena had picked up her father's M16. 15 years old, 80 pounds, soaking wet, wearing a Target t-shirt and her father's dog tags. She'd killed 2 insurgents before the Marines counterattacked, saved Dutton's life, changed her own forever. He'd found her afterwards, sitting against a wall with the rifle across her lap, shaking so hard her teeth chattered, despite the desert heat. And instead of treating her like a traumatized child, he'd treated her like a soldier. "Good work," he'd said simply. "Your father would be proud." Those 4 words had become the foundation of everything that followed it. The informal training sessions at bases around the world, wherever Dutton was stationed, and wherever the Army parked her and her grieving mother. The recommendation letter that got her into specialized programs at 18. The phone call that connected her with CIA recruiters looking for someone with her particular skill set. The 12 years of ghost operations in places that officially didn't exist, doing things that officially never happened. 79 seconds. That's how long it had taken her to dismantle four of the Navy's finest. And somewhere in whatever office Dutton was using these days, she knew he was smiling. Because those 79 seconds weren't just about proving she could fight. They were about proving she still had the edge, the instinct, the will to do what needed doing when the situation demanded it. After Kandahar, after losing two of her team because she'd trusted intelligence that turned out to be fatally wrong, she'd wondered if she'd lost it. If the guilt and the nightmares had dulled her enough to make her a liability. 79 seconds was her answer. Elena lay back on the narrow bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, and allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Kane and his team weren't finished. Men like that never were. They'd regroup, strategize, come at her from a different angle. But she'd be ready. She'd always been ready. Outside her window, the sounds of Fort Wexler continued their eternal rhythm. Boots on pavement, engines turning over. Drill sergeants barking cadence. The machinery of military life grinding forward, indifferent to individual dramas and private victories. But somewhere in that machinery, 4 Navy SEALs were mopping floors and reconsidering their assumptions about gender capability and the dangerous arrogance of underestimating people based on chromosomes instead of competence. And somewhere else, a 68-year-old general was probably having the best day he'd had in years. 79 seconds. The number would become legend by nightfall, whispered in mess halls and rec rooms, embellished and exaggerated until it took on mythic proportions. But the men who'd lived through it would know the truth. They'd carry the memory of those 79 seconds for the rest of their lives, a permanent reminder that respect isn't granted by rank or gender. It's earned in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moments when capability meets challenge, and in the aftermath when the only honest response is to acknowledge that you've been outmatched by someone better. Elena closed her eyes, her breathing evening out into the slow rhythm of approaching sleep. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight she could rest knowing she'd answered the question that had haunted her since Kandahar. She still had it, every bit of it, and anyone who doubted that had 79 seconds of proof to the contrary. The observation deck at 0600 was already packed when Elena arrived, coffee in hand, her uniform crisp despite the early hour. Word had spread like wildfire through the base's informal communication network, the one that operated faster than any official chain of command. The woman who dismantled 4 SEALs in 79 seconds was about to face them again, and this time the stakes were different. This time it was personal. Major Billings stood at the front of the room, his expression carefully neutral, but Elena could read the tension in his shoulders. Behind him, a projection screen displayed the warehouse layout, the same configuration as yesterday, but with modifications. Red zones marked potential ambush points. Blue zones indicated high-value targets. Yellow zones were designated safe areas where simunition fire was prohibited. The 4 SEALs entered last, and the change in their demeanor was immediately apparent. Gone was the casual arrogance, the easy laughter, the dismissive glances. Kane walked with military precision, his jaw set, his eyes focused straight ahead. Webb followed close behind, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd spent the night analyzing his mistakes. Cross and Brooks brought up the rear, their usual banter replaced by tense silence. They'd spent 12 hours mopping floors, scrubbing toilets, and contemplating the brutal efficiency with which they'd been humiliated. 12 hours was enough time for embarrassment to ferment into something more dangerous. Determination. Rage. The burning need for redemption. Billings cleared his throat, commanding attention without raising his voice. Gentlemen and Sergeant Reeves, yesterday's exercise revealed certain deficiencies in tactical awareness and threat assessment. Today we're going to address those deficiencies directly. He gestured to the screen where the warehouse layout glowed in harsh digital clarity. This morning's scenario will be different. Same objective, secure the high-value target in the center room. Same time limit, 3 minutes. But this time Sergeant Reeves will be armed. A murmur rippled through the observation deck. Elena felt dozens of eyes on her back, measuring, judging, wondering if yesterday had been luck or skill. Kane's hand shot up. Sir, request clarification. What's the team composition? Billings consulted his notes, but Elena caught the slight hesitation the way his eyes flicked toward the back of the room where General Dutton stood in the shadows watching. Same as yesterday, Lieutenant. 4-person SEAL team with Sergeant Reeves as evaluator. Armed or unarmed, sir? The question hung in the air like a blade suspended on a thread. Billings knew what Kane was really asking. Yesterday's humiliation had come from being unable to use their weapons effectively against an unarmed opponent in close quarters. Today, with everyone armed, the dynamics would shift dramatically. Range and firepower would matter. Numbers would matter. Everyone will be armed with standard simunition loadouts, Billings said finally. M4 rifles, sidearms, standard tactical gear. No restrictions. Kane's smile was predatory. Understood, sir. Elena sipped her coffee, her expression revealing nothing. But her mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating angles and probabilities. Armed combat changed everything. The SEALs would maintain distance-use suppressing fire and employ tactical formations designed to maximize their numerical advantage. They'd learned from yesterday. They wouldn't make the same mistakes twice, which meant she'd have to make new mistakes for them to exploit. Billings continued with the briefing, outlining rules of engagement, safety protocols, medical evacuation procedures, standard operating procedure for live fire exercises, even with simunition. But Elena barely listened. She was watching Kane, studying the micro-expressions that flickered across his face like shadows. This wasn't about training anymore. This was about pride, about proving that yesterday had been an aberration, a fluke, a lucky sequence of events that couldn't be repeated. Men like Kane didn't accept defeat gracefully. They metabolized it, transformed it, weaponized it. And now he had had 12 hours to turn his humiliation into fuel. The briefing ended. The crowd on the observation deck shifted, positioning themselves for optimal viewing angles. Elena noted the increased security presence, 2 MPs stationed at the exits, a medic with full trauma kit standing by. Someone was taking this seriously. Someone recognized that putting 5 highly trained warriors in a confined space with live ammunition, even simunition, was courting disaster. She finished her coffee, crushed the paper cup, and tossed it in the recycling bin with the casual precision of a basketball free throw. Nothing to see here, just another training day, just another opportunity to demonstrate capability under controlled conditions. Except there was nothing controlled about the energy crackling through this room. This was going to be war. The armory had the same smell as yesterday: gun oil, metal polish, testosterone, and competition. But the atmosphere was different. Yesterday's mockery had been replaced by cold professionalism. The petty officer behind the wire mesh counter handed Elena her M4 without comment, his eyes refusing to meet hers. The sidearm followed along with 4 magazines of simunition rounds marked with bright orange tape to distinguish them from live ammunition. Elena performed her checks with the same methodical precision as always. Chamber clear, magazine seated, sights aligned, sling adjusted. Every movement practiced 10,000 times until it became muscle memory, automatic as breathing. Across the armory, Kane and his team performed their own ritual preparations. But there was an intensity to their movements that hadn't been present yesterday, a focus that suggested they'd spent the night planning, strategizing, wargaming every possible scenario. They'd watched the footage, dissected her techniques, identified her patterns. They thought they knew her now. Webb approached first, his weathered face neutral, but his eyes sharp. "Sergeant?" A nod, nothing more. Not quite respect, but no longer dismissal. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that she was a legitimate threat. "Chief," Elena replied, matching his tone. "Today's going to be different. It wasn't a threat, just a statement of fact. I'd be disappointed if it wasn't." Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of Webb's mouth. Fair enough. He returned to his team where Kane was giving last-minute instructions, his voice low and urgent. Elena caught fragments. Maintain distance. Overlapping fields of fire. If she closes the gap, crossfire protocols. They'd done their homework. They'd identified that her advantage yesterday had been her ability to get inside their defensive perimeter to turn their weapons into liabilities. Today they'd maintain standoff distance, use their superior firepower to keep her at range, rely on coordinated fire to pin her down. It was a good plan, A solid plan. The kind of plan that would work against 99% of opponents. Elena wasn't 99%. The staging area felt different today. Yesterday's carnival atmosphere had been replaced by something heavier, more primal. The observation deck was standing room only, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, all eyes fixed on the warehouse entrance. Money was changing hands. Someone was running a betting pool on how long the engagement would last, who would score first blood, whether Elena would survive the opening 30 seconds. The odds weren't in her favor. 4-1 numerical advantage, 4 rifles against 1. 4 sets of eyes, 4 angles of approach, 4 opportunities to put her down before she could employ the close quarters techniques that had saved her yesterday. But odds were just mathematics, and mathematics didn't account for will, for experience, for the kind of cold fury that came from being systematically underestimated and mocked. Major Billings's voice crackled over the loudspeaker. Team Alpha stage at entrance point. Team Bravo, he paused, and Elena heard the slight awkwardness in his voice. Sergeant Reeves stage at entrance point 2 Eastern Side. Different entry points. They weren't even pretending this was a cooperative exercise anymore. This was force-on-force, predator versus predators, and may the best warrior win. Elena moved to her designated position, a secondary entrance, on the warehouse's eastern wall. The door was narrower than the main entrance, less tactically advantageous, forcing her into a potential choke point before she even entered the main space. Another handicap, another way to stack the deck in favor of the home team. She didn't complain. Complaining was for people who expected fairness. The universe didn't deal in fairness. It dealt in physics, in probability, in the brutal calculus of survival. Through the door, she could hear the seals stacking up at the main entrance. Kane's voice carried clearly. Remember, maintain separation. She can't engage what she can't reach. Suppressing fire on any movement. Webb, you anchor. Cross Brooks mobile flanking. I'll control center. Textbook tactics, the kind they taught at every tactical school in the country. Proven reliable, effective, also predictable. The countdown began. 10 seconds. Elena's breathing slowed, her heart rate dropping into that strange calm that came before violence. The world narrowed to tactical considerations. Entry points, angles of fire, cover and concealment. The physics of ballistics in the geometry of lethal force. 5 seconds. She shifted her weight, testing the door's resistance. Solid but not reinforced. Could be breached with sufficient force if necessary. 3 seconds. Final check, magazine, seated safety off selector to semi-auto. Red dot sight glowing like a tiny star in the dim light. 1 second. The whistle blew. Elena hit the door, moving, not waiting for it to fully open, using her momentum to explode into the warehouse in a low crouch that made her a smaller target. The space beyond was a maze of shadows and harsh lighting, plywood walls creating quarters and kill zones and dead ends. Immediately, she heard the thunder of boots on concrete from the main entrance, Kane's team pushing hard and fast, trying to secure the center before she could establish position. Their strategy was obvious: control the high-value target, force her to come to them, engage on their terms with maximum firepower. A good strategy if she played their game. Elena went the opposite direction, away from the objective, deeper into the maze of corridors. She heard shouting from the main staging area, Kane calling out room clears, Webb confirming sectors of fire. Professional, coordinated, exactly by the book. She found what she was looking for in the northwest corner, a maintenance ladder leading to the warehouse's upper level, a metal catwalk that ran the perimeter of the building. Not part of the official training scenario, probably supposed to be off limits, but no one had specifically said it was prohibited. And in combat, anything not explicitly prohibited was tactically viable. The ladder rang softly under her boots as she climbed, each step measured and quiet, despite the urgent need for speed. Below, she heard Kane's team reaching the center room, their voices carrying clearly in the warehouse's acoustic dead space. Center room secure, target not present. Where is she? Not at entrance 2, check southern corridor. Webb, you see anything? Negative, she should have engaged by now. From her elevated position on the catwalk, Elena could see the entire warehouse floor spread below, like a tactical map made flesh. Kane stood in the center room, his rifle up, turning slowly to scan for threats. Webb held the southern approach, covering his team leader's back. Cross and Brooks were splitting off to search the side corridors, moving with cautious precision. They were looking for her on ground level. It never occurred to them to look up. Elena settled into a stable shooting position, bracing her rifle against the catwalk's metal railing. The red dot sight found Cross first. He was moving through the open, confident in his team's coverage, not expecting overhead fire. The simunition round caught him in the center chest, the impact audible even from 20 feet up. He staggered, looked down at the orange paint splatter, then up at the catwalk. Contact high, she's. The second round cut off his report. Official kill according to simunition protocols, 2 center mass hits. Cross raised his hands and backed against the wall, officially out of the fight. Kane reacted instantly, professional instincts overriding surprise. Overhead position, northwest corner, suppressing fire. His rifle barked rounds sparking off the metal catwalk, forcing Elena to roll away from the railing. But she'd already moved, sliding along the catwalk's length while his attention was fixed on her last position. Brooks appeared below, searching for an angle, and Elena's rifle cracked twice more. Orange blooms on his shoulder and neck. Not perfect shots, but close enough for training purposes. Damn it! Brooks threw his rifle down in frustration, then caught himself, remembered he was being evaluated, and adopted the official casualty posture. 2 down in 30 seconds. Kane was recalculating now. She could see it in his body language. The numerical advantage had just been cut in half. Webb was still somewhere in the southern sector, too smart to expose himself. That meant Kane was alone in the center, defending the high-value target, but unable to advance without exposing himself to overhead fire. Stalemate, except stalemates favored defenders, and Kane knew it. If he could hold position long enough for time to expire, he could claim tactical victory even with half his team eliminated. Elena dropped from the catwalk, not climbing down, not taking the ladder, just dropping 15 feet straight down, hitting the concrete with bent knees in a forward roll that absorbed the impact and brought her up moving. The landing was loud, no way to avoid that, but by the time Kane swung toward the sound, she was already in motion. He fired, but she was cutting angles, moving laterally while closing distance, making herself a difficult target through pure aggressive movement. His rounds went wide, sparking off concrete and plywood. She fired back, not aimed shots, but suppressing fire, keeping him defensive, unable to establish a stable shooting platform. The distance closed to 20 feet. 15. 10. Kane did the smart thing. He retreated, falling back through the doorway into the center room where he could use the structure for cover. But in that brief moment when he was silhouetted in the doorway, backlit by the harsh overhead lights, Elena's rifle spoke twice. The first round caught his thigh, not a kill shot, but a mobility hit. The second caught his rifle itself, impacting the receiver with enough force to jam the simunition mechanism. Kane stumbled, went down on one knee, fumbled for his sidearm. Too slow. Elena was already there, her rifle's muzzle inches from his chest. Bang, she said quietly. Kane froze his hand halfway to his holster. For 3 seconds, they stayed that way, locked in that intimate space where combat becomes personal. Then he slowly raised his hands, acknowledging the kill. How, he said, and it wasn't quite a question. You fought the scenario you planned for, Elena replied. Not the scenario that was actually happening. Movement behind her, Webb finally closing in from the southern sector, his rifle up and tracking. Elena spun, using Kane's body as partial cover, and fired. But Webb had seen her technique, now understood her preference for aggressive forward movement. He'd anticipated, positioned himself with superior angles. His simunition rounds caught her shoulder, her side, her leg. 3 hits in rapid succession. By training protocols, she was dead twice over. Elena lowered her rifle and raised her hands. Good shot, Chief. Webb didn't lower his weapon immediately. He approached cautiously, as if expecting a trick, his eyes never leaving hers. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something that hadn't been there yesterday. Respect. You took 3 of us in under 2 minutes. Hell of a run, Sergeant. The whistle blew. Time limit reached. Exercise complete. The observation deck erupted in noise voices, overlapping in argument and analysis and grudging admiration. Elena saved her weapon and helped Kane to his feet. He met her eyes, and something passed between them. Not friendship, not even quite respect yet, but acknowledgement. The understanding that they were both professionals, both warriors, and that yesterday's humiliation had been earned, not gifted. I want a rematch, Kane said. Elena almost smiled. You just had one. I want another one, 6 months from now, after we've trained with your techniques. Now she did smile. You planning to incorporate my methods into your curriculum, Lieutenant? Kane's jaw worked for a moment, pride warring with pragmatism. Finally, pride's a liability in combat. You taught me that. I'd be a fool not to learn from someone better. The word hung between them. Better. Not different, not specialized, not advantaged by circumstances. Better. It was the closest thing to an apology she'd get from a man like Kane, and it was enough. Major Billings descended from the observation deck, followed by General Dutton. The old man's face was carefully neutral, but Elena caught the approval in his eyes. This was what he'd wanted, not just for her to prove her capability, but for these young warriors to learn humility, adaptability, the understanding that there was always someone better, always something new to learn. Interesting approach, Sergeant. Billings said, his tone carefully diplomatic. Using the catwalk was creative. Tactically sound, Dutton interjected. In real combat, there are no rules about staying on ground level. The enemy certainly won't limit themselves to convenient engagement zones. He turned to Kane. You learned something today, Lieutenant? Kane straightened to attention. Yes, sir. Multiple lessons, sir. Good. That's why we train. That's why we test ourselves against unfamiliar opponents in uncomfortable scenarios. Dutton's gaze swept across all of them, Elena Kane Webb, the still frustrated Cross Ann Brooks. The moment you think you know everything is the moment you become a liability to your team. The crowd on the observation deck was dispersing now, the show over the betting pools being settled. But Elena noticed something different in the way people looked at her as they passed. Yesterday had been shock surprise, the thrill of seeing the underdog triumph. Today was different. Today they'd seen her adapt, strategize, think 3 moves ahead while under fire. Today they'd seen not just capability, but mastery. Webb approached as the others were securing their gear. Sergeant, a word. They stepped away from the group into the relative privacy of a shadowed corner. Webb's weathered face was serious, but his hostility had been replaced by something more complex. I did some research last night, he said quietly. Called in some favors. Found out about Kandahar. Elena's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in her chest. That's classified. Most of it, but I know people who know people. I know you lost 2 operators on a bad intel mission. I know you were team leader. I know you blamed yourself enough to walk away from C. He paused, watching her carefully. I also know the intelligence officer who fed you that bad intel was later court-martialed for negligence. It wasn't your fault, Sergeant. Doesn't matter whose fault it was. They're still dead. It matters to me. Webb's voice was firm. Because I spent 12 hours last night thinking about why you came back here. Why you'd put yourself through this dog and pony show with a bunch of arrogant SEALs who treated you like garbage. And I think I figured it out. Elena waited, not confirming or denying. You needed to prove to yourself that you still had it. That Kandahar didn't break you. That you could still operate under pressure, still make the hard calls, still win when it mattered. Webb met her eyes. Well, you proved it, to yourself and to everyone else. So what happens now? It was a good question. Elena had been so focused on surviving the next challenge, proving herself in the next engagement, that she hadn't thought much about what came after. The evaluation was supposed to last 2 weeks. She'd been here 2 days and already demonstrated more than any written report could convey. I finished the evaluation, she said finally. I do the job I was assigned. And then I figure out the next thing. Webb nodded slowly. If you need a reference, I'd be honored to provide one. You're the best close quarters operator I've seen in 20 years of service, and that includes some legendary names. He extended his hand. It would be a privilege to train with you instead of against you. Elena shook his hand, surprised by the firmness of his grip, the sincerity in his voice. This was a man who'd spent decades in special operations, who'd seen combat in a dozen countries, who'd earned his rank and respect through blood and sacrifice. His words carried weight. Thank you, Chief. Call me Aaron. I think we're past ranks at this point. As Webb walked away, Elena found herself alone in the warehouse's shadows, the adrenaline from the engagement slowly fading, leaving behind the familiar post-combat clarity. 2 days. She'd been at Fort Wexler for 2 days, and already her world had shifted in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Yesterday, she'd been trying to prove she deserved to be here. Today, she'd been trying to prove she could win under different conditions against opponents who'd learned from their mistakes. Tomorrow, Tomorrow would require something different. Kane wouldn't accept another defeat gracefully. His pride had been wounded twice now, and wounded pride in a warrior was like a wounded animal, dangerous, unpredictable, capable of actions that rational thought would normally prevent. She could see it coming, could feel the shape of it forming even without knowing the details. Kane would want another match, another chance, but this time he'd change the parameters even more dramatically. He'd push for conditions that nullified her advantages, that forced her to operate outside her comfort zone. He'd want to break her the way she'd broken him, and he wouldn't be subtle about it. Elena retrieved her gear from the armory, enduring the knowing looks from the petty officer behind the counter. She'd become famous in the span of 48 hours, the woman who'd made Navy SEALs look ordinary, who'd proven that gender was irrelevant when skill and experience were equal. But fame was a double-edged sword. It brought attention, expectations, pressure to perform at peak level every single time. One slip, one mistake, one moment of human fallibility, and the narrative would shift from impressive operator to she finally cracked under pressure. The weight of that expectation settled on her shoulders as she walked across the compound toward her temporary quarters. The August sun was brutal now, turning the base into a landscape of harsh shadows and glaring light. Somewhere in the distance, drill sergeants were barking cadence. Helicopters were beating the air with their rotors. The machinery of military life ground forward, indifferent to individual dramas. But Elena carried those dramas with her. The memory of Kandahar, of her two operators bleeding out while she screamed into a radio for Casevac that arrived 3 minutes too late. The weight of command, the burden of decisions made in seconds that reverberated through lifetimes. The question that had haunted her for 2 years, was she still capable of leading? Or had she used up her allocation of luck and skill? 2 days at Fort Wexler had answered part of that question. She could still fight, could still read combat dynamics, still make tactical decisions under pressure, still execute with precision when violence was the only remaining option. But fighting and leading weren't the same thing. Fighting was individual capability. Leadership was something else entirely, the ability to see 3 moves ahead, not just for yourself, but for your entire team, to make decisions that balanced mission success against acceptable losses, to carry the weight of command without letting it crush you. She hadn't been tested on leadership yet, just on capability, on personal combat effectiveness. And she suspected no, she knew that the real test was still coming. Because men like Kane didn't just want to beat her in combat. They wanted to break her completely, to prove that yesterday and today were flukes, that given the right circumstances, she was no better than anyone else. And maybe they were right. Maybe under the right pressure, with the right stakes, she would fold. Maybe Kandahar had left cracks in her foundation that couldn't be repaired, only papered over with bravado and desperate action. Elena reached her quarters and closed the door behind her, shutting out the Fort Wexler noise and heat. The room was Spartan military, cot, metal locker, small desk with a lamp. Nothing personal, nothing that couldn't be packed up in 5 minutes and loaded onto a transport. She sat on the cot and closed her eyes, breathing slowly, letting the day's adrenaline drain away. 2 engagements, 2 victories, 1 complete, 1 partial. She'd proven she could adapt, could think tactically under fire, could survive against superior numbers and firepower. But survival wasn't the same as triumph, and triumph wasn't the same as redemption. The thing about Kandahar, the thing that woke her up at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, wasn't just that her operators had died. It was that she'd known the intelligence was questionable, had felt something wrong in her gut, and had authorized the mission anyway because the target was high value and command was pressuring for results. She'd ignored her instincts in favor of orders, and 2 good people had paid the price. That was the real test ahead. Not whether she could fight, but whether she could trust herself to lead again. To make the hard calls knowing that people's lives hung in the balance. To live with the consequences when those calls proved wrong. General Dutton would understand that. He'd lost people too, had made decisions that haunted him decades later. That's why he'd brought her back here, not just to prove she could fight, but to force her to confront the question of whether she could lead. And Kane Webb-Cross and Brooks, they were the instrument of that test, whether they knew it or not. Each engagement pushed her further, forced her to operate under different conditions, challenged her to adapt and overcome. But eventually, adaptation wouldn't be enough. Eventually, she'd face a scenario where there was no tactical solution, no clever trick, no way to win through superior skill alone. She'd face a situation that required leadership, command decisions, trust in her team, and her instincts. That's when she'd discover whether Kandahar had broken her or just bent her. Elena lay back on the cot, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, and allowed herself to acknowledge the fear she'd been suppressing for 2 years. Not fear of combat, not fear of death, but fear of responsibility. Fear of being trusted with lives again. Fear of the moment when she'd have to choose between following orders and following her gut. Outside her window, Fort Wexler continued its eternal rhythm. But inside this small room, Elena Reeves confronted the truth she'd been avoiding since the day she walked away from CIOA. The hardest battles weren't fought with weapons. They were fought with yourself in the quiet moments when there was nothing left to prove to anyone else. And you had to decide whether you could trust the person staring back from the mirror. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Kane would demand his rematch, would change the rules again, would push until something broke. And Elena would meet him, there would fight whatever fight was required. But eventually, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, she'd face the fight that mattered most. The one where skill and training weren't enough, where she'd have to trust herself completely or fail completely. And when that moment came, she'd discover whether 79 seconds of tactical excellence could outweigh 2 years of self-doubt. Whether she was still the warrior General Dutton believed in, or just a broken operator pretending to be whole. The answer was coming, whether she was ready or not. The knock came at 05:30 before Reveille, before the sun had burned away the night's lingering coolness. Elena was already awake, had been for an hour, sitting on the edge of her cot and staring at the darkness beyond her window. Sleep had become a luxury she couldn't afford, not when her dreams were populated by the ghosts of Kandahar. She opened the door to find Webb standing in the pre-dawn gloom, his face grave. "We need to talk. Now. Somewhere private." They walked to the eastern perimeter of the base where the maintenance sheds provided cover from casual observation. The sky was beginning to lighten, turning from black to deep purple, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its morning complaint. Webb didn't waste time with pleasantries. Kane went to Dutton last night, requested a final exercise. Force on force, full scenario, all five of us working together against a simulated enemy force. He paused, watching her reaction. Dutton approved it. Elena processed this information without visible emotion, but her mind was already racing through implications. Team composition. That's the thing. It's a hostage rescue scenario. 12 instructors playing hostile forces, heavily armed, defending a fortified position. Our job is to infiltrate, neutralize threats, extract the package. A mannequin representing a high-value target. Standard SEAL team operation. Webb's eyes were troubled. Except Kane added a condition. If any member of the five-person team is killed according to engagement protocols, the entire team fails. Mission abort, no exceptions. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Individual excellence wouldn't matter. Elena could be the best operator on the field, could execute flawlessly, but if Kane or any of the others made a mistake, got careless, took a bad angle, the entire mission would collapse. And the blame would fall on the team leader, on whoever was responsible for coordinating five warriors with different training, different instincts, different levels of trust in each other. Who's team leader? Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. Comey nominated you. Said if you're going to evaluate SEAL training protocols, you should demonstrate leadership capability, not just individual combat skills. Webb's expression was grim. Dutton agreed. She said it was a fair test of command under pressure. There it was. The test she'd known was coming, the one that would force her to confront the question she'd been avoiding for 2 years. Could she lead? Could she make command decisions, knowing that mistakes would cost not just the mission, but potentially lives? Could she trust herself after Kandahar? When, Elena asked, 1,400 hours, 6 hours to plan, brief, prepare. The scenario is supposed to simulate an emergency response, minimal preparation time, high-stress, forced decision-making under incomplete information. Webb shifted his weight, uncomfortable with what he had to say next. Look, I know what Kane's doing. He's setting you up to fail. He's betting that you'll either refuse to take command, which makes you look weak, or you'll accept and crack under the pressure when things go sideways. Things always go sideways, Elena said quietly. Yeah, they do. Webb met her eyes. But here's the thing, Sergeant. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've served under a lot of leaders, good and bad. And in 2 days, you've shown me more tactical intelligence than most of them demonstrated in their entire careers. So if you take this command, if you call the shots today, I'll follow them. No hesitation, no second guessing. It was a gift, that declaration of trust, more valuable than any medal or commendation. But it was also a weight, a responsibility, the exact burden Elena had been trying to escape. I'll think about it, she said. Webb nodded and started to walk away, then turned back. One more thing. Dutton wants to see you. 0600 his office. He said it's important. General Frank Dutton's office was located in the administrative building, a corner room with windows overlooking the training fields. The walls were covered with photographs spanning 4 decades of military service. Dutton, as a young lieutenant in Desert Storm, as a captain in Somalia, as a major in Afghanistan, as a colonel in Iraq. A career written in deployments and citations and the gradual accumulation of rank. Elena knocked once and entered when summoned. Dutton was standing at the window, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over Fort Wexler. He didn't turn immediately, just let her stand there in silence, waiting. You know what today is, he finally asked. Wednesday, sir. It's 20 years to the day since Fallujah, since the first battle, since your father died and you picked up his rifle. Now he turned and his eyes held something Elena couldn't quite identify. Grief maybe, or recognition. 20 years since a 15-year-old girl saved my life and changed her own forever. Elena said nothing. There was nothing to say. The past was fixed, immutable, a foundation that couldn't be rebuilt or revised. Dutton set down his coffee and walked to his desk where a manila folder lay centered with military precision. I never told you this, but after Fallujah, I tried to adopt you. Officially. Went through legal channels, submitted paperwork, made formal requests through JAG. He tapped the folder. Know what they told me? That I was too close to the situation, too emotionally compromised, that my judgment was clouded by survivor's guilt. They said you needed stability and normalcy, not another military mentor pushing you toward a career in combat. You trained me anyway, Elena said. I did. Informally, quietly, whenever our paths crossed. Because I saw something in you that day, something that couldn't be taught or instilled through discipline. You had the warrior's instinct, that split-second ability to assess threats and respond with appropriate violence. It's rare. Maybe 1 in 10,000 people have it naturally, and even fewer can develop it through training. Dutton opened the folder, revealing photographs, psychological evaluations, classified briefing documents. But instinct alone isn't enough for leadership. Leadership requires something else. The ability to send people into danger knowing some of them won't come back. The capacity to make those decisions and still sleep at night. I don't sleep at night, sir. I know. Kandahar. The word hung between them like smoke. I read the after-action reports, plural, because there were 3 different investigations, each more thorough than the last. And you know what they all concluded? That you followed protocol, that the intelligence was vetted through appropriate channels, that the decision to authorize the mission was tactically sound given available information. He closed the folder with finality. They also concluded that the intelligence officer who provided that information was negligent, possibly compromised, and definitely responsible for the deaths of your 2 operators. Doesn't change anything, Elena said. They're still dead. I was still team leader. No, it doesn't change anything. Leadership means carrying that weight forever. But here's what you need to understand, Sergeant. That weight, that guilt, that responsibility, that awareness that your decisions have consequences, that's not a weakness. It's what makes you a good leader. The bad ones don't feel it. They compartmentalize, rationalize, sleep soundly because they've convinced themselves they did everything right. The good ones carry their dead and let that weight inform every subsequent decision. Dutton walked back to the window, his voice dropping to something more intimate, more personal. I carry 17 names, 17 Marines who died under my command across 4 deployments. I can recite their names alphabetically, chronologically, by rank, by age. I dream about them. I second-guess decisions I made 20 years ago. And that's appropriate. That's right. Because the moment I stop carrying them is the moment I lose the humanity that makes me worthy of command. He turned back to face her, and his expression was fierce. Kane set up today's exercise to break you, to prove that you're all tactical skill and no leadership capability, that you choke when other people's lives depend on your decisions. But here's what he doesn't understand, what none of these young warriors understand because they haven't lived it yet. Real leadership isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified, recognizing all the ways things can go wrong, and making the call anyway because someone has to. What if I make the wrong call again? Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. Then you'll carry more weight, and it will hurt, and you'll question yourself at 3 in the morning for the rest of your life. Dutton's smile was sad and knowing. But you'll make the call anyway because that's who you are. That's who you've always been since the day you picked up your father's rifle and decided some things were worth fighting for even when you're terrified. He returned to his desk and retrieved something from the top drawer. A small cloth patch faded with age showing a sparrow in flight against a blue background. Elena recognized it immediately, her call sign from CIA, the insignia she'd worn on her kit during dozens of operations. I kept this, Dutton said, handing it to her. Figured you'd need it again someday. Because warriors like you don't stay retired. You might take a break, might question yourself, might hide from responsibility for a while. But eventually you come back. You have to. It's in your blood. Elena took the patch, her fingers tracing the embroidered sparrow. How many missions had she worn this? How many times had she stared at it while planning operations, while coordinating teams, while making the calls that meant life or death for people who trusted her judgment? Today's not about Kane or his ego, Dutton continued. It's about you deciding whether you're still a warrior or just someone who used to be one. Whether you trust yourself enough to lead again, to risk being wrong, to accept that perfect decisions don't exist, and you'll do the best you can with imperfect information. And if I fail, then you fail, and you learn from it and do better next time. That's how this works, Sergeant. That's how it's always worked. Dutton stood at attention, formal now, commanding. You have 5 hours until mission brief. I suggest you use them wisely. Elena saluted, received his salute in return, and left his office with the sparrow patch clutched in her hand. The sun was fully up now, turning Fort Wexler into a landscape of stark contrasts and hard shadows. Somewhere on this base, Kane and his team were preparing for the exercise planning strategize, convinced that today would prove Elena's limitations. They were right about one thing. Today would be a test, a crucible that would reveal truth. But the truth they'd discover might not be the one they expected. The briefing room at 1300 hours was packed with observers, everyone sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Elena stood at the front next to the whiteboard covered in tactical diagrams and surveyed the 4 men who would be under her command for the next hour. Kane sat in the front row, his expression carefully neutral, but his body language screaming defiance. Webb was beside him, calm and ready, a professional waiting for orders. Cross and Brooks occupied the second row, exchanging nervous glances, aware that today's exercise carried stakes beyond the typical training scenario. Major Billings handled the initial briefing. The target building was Warehouse 7, the largest structure on base, configured to represent a 3-story office complex held by hostile forces. 12 instructors would play enemy combatants armed with simunition and authorized to use aggressive tactics. The high-value target was located on the 3rd floor, precise room unknown. Rules of engagement were standard: 3 hits constituted a kill. 1 team member killed meant mission failure. Time limit 30 minutes from breach to extraction. When Billings finished, he yielded the floor to Elena. She stood, walked to the whiteboard, and studied the building diagram in silence for 10 seconds that felt like hours. Then she turned to face her team. Here's what we're not going to do, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. We're not going to breach through the main entrance. We're not going to clear rooms sequentially. We're not going to follow any standard tactical approach that our opponents will anticipate and prepare for. She picked up a marker and began drawing on the diagram, modifying the building's layout with quick, confident strokes. Warehouse 7 has a maintenance access point on the eastern wall, a service door that leads directly to the internal stairwell. It's narrow, defensible, and everyone forgets about it because it's not part of the standard floor plan. She circled the location. That's our entry point. Kane raised his hand. That door is probably defended. They'll expect us to look for alternatives to main entrance. They'll expect a ground-level alternative. They won't expect us to breach at ground level and immediately go vertical. Elena drew arrows indicating movement up the stairwell. We hit the service entrance fast. Don't stop to clear the 1st or 2nd floors. Go straight to the 3rd. Our opponents will be staged to defend against a traditional room-to-room clear. By the time they realize we've bypassed their defensive positions, we'll already have the target. Webb leaned forward, studying the diagram. That puts us in a vulnerable position on the stairs. One person with a rifle could lock down the entire stairwell. Yes, which is why we're not all going up the stairs. Elena drew a second arrow, this one indicating the building's exterior. Cross our overwatch. There's a water tower 60 meters east of Warehouse 7 with clear sight lines to the third-floor windows. You'll climb it, establish position, and provide covering fire through the windows while we're extracting the target. Anyone moves to intercept us on the third floor, you light them up. Cross nodded slowly, seeing the logic. Simunition effective range from that distance. Marginal but sufficient for suppression. You won't need to score kills, just keep them honest. Make them think twice about moving to windows or exposed positions. Kane's expression had shifted from skeptical to calculatingly interested. What about the first and second floors? Once we have the target, we still need to extract, and by then they'll know exactly where we are. That's where you come in, Lieutenant. Elena met his eyes directly. You and Brooks will be our blocking force. Once we're on the third floor and located the target, you two fall back to the second floor landing and establish a defensive position. Your job is to hold that position against anyone trying to follow us down. You don't need to win, just delay. Buy us 60 seconds. And if they overwhelm our position, then Webb and I will handle the extraction alone while you two create chaos and draw fire. But I don't think they'll overwhelm you. Not in 60 seconds. Not if you use the terrain and force them into a narrow approach where numbers don't matter. Brooks spoke up, his young face serious. That leaves you and Chief Webb to locate and extract the target on your own. Third floor could be 12 rooms, maybe more. How do you narrow down the search? Elena smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the smile of a predator explaining the hunt. We don't search. We make them tell us. She turned back to the diagram and drew a new element, a small circle in the center of the third floor. There's a central hallway on 3 connecting all the rooms. First thing we do is deploy a flashbang into that hallway. Not to blind anyone, but to create confusion to force a reaction. Whoever's guarding the high-value target will instinctively move toward it, either to protect it or because they're startled. We watch the doors. Whichever room has movement immediately after the flashbang, that's our target. The room had gone quiet. Even the observers on the periphery had stopped their whispered conversations, recognizing that they were watching something more than a simple tactical brief. This was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, in using inferior numbers and resources to overcome a prepared defensive force. Webb broke the silence. It's aggressive, high risk, a lot of moving parts that need to work in synchronization. Yes. Elena set down the marker. It also gives us the only realistic chance of success. A conventional approach plays to their strengths, numbers, prepared positions, defensive advantage. We need to create chaos, move faster than they can react and extract before they can organize a coordinated response. Kane walked to the whiteboard and studied the diagram with the intensity of a man recalculating his assumptions. What happens if Cross can't establish overwatch in time, or if the maintenance door is locked, or if they have more defenders on the third floor than you anticipate? Then we adapt. Combat plans never survive first contact. But we start with a strong foundation, a clear concept of operations, and most importantly, Elena looked at each of them in turn, holding their gazes. We trust each other. No second guessing, no ego, no hesitation. I make the calls, you execute them, and we all get out together. And if we fail, Kane's question was direct, challenging. Then we fail as a team, and we learn from it. Elena's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. But I don't plan on failing. For 3 long seconds, Kane and Elena locked eyes, each measuring the other, each seeing something that hadn't been visible before. Then Kane nodded once, sharp and decisive. Understood. We're in. The planning session lasted another 30 minutes, working through contingencies, establishing communication protocols, rehearsing movements. By the time they broke to gear up, the 5 of them had transformed from competing individuals into something resembling a team. Not quite trust, not yet, but operational unity. The recognition that success required subordinating individual egos to collective purpose. Elena returned to her quarters and carefully attached the sparrow patch to her vest right above her heart. The fabric was faded, the stitching worn, but the symbol remained clear. A small bird, unremarkable in appearance, deadly in execution. It felt right wearing it again, like putting on an old jacket that still fit perfectly despite the years. The walk to Warehouse 7 felt longer than the actual distance, each step carrying weight. Elena was aware of eyes on her, of whispers following in her wake, of the pressure building like atmosphere before a storm. The observation deck was standing room only, every available space packed with spectators. Someone had even set up a video feed projecting the interior warehouse cameras onto external screens so the crowd could watch in real time. Kane, Webb, Cross, and Brooks were already at the staging area, checking weapons, adjusting kit, moving through pre-mission rituals. Elena joined them, and without discussion, they formed a circle, each looking at the others. "Last chance to change your minds," Elena said quietly. "No judgment if you want to walk away." "We're in," Kane said, and the others nodded agreement. "Then here's what I need you to understand. I've made mistakes. I've led missions that went wrong. I've lost people." Elena's voice was steady but carried the weight of confession. "I can't promise perfect decisions. I can't promise we'll all walk away clean, but I can promise I'll do everything in my power to bring us all home. And if that's not enough, if you can't trust my judgment, now's the time to say so." Webb spoke first. "You've earned my trust, Sergeant. Let's do this." Cross and Brooks voiced agreement. Finally, Kane stepped forward and extended his hand. "2 days ago, I thought you were a diversity hire, someone the Army sent to check a box. I was wrong. You're a warrior. So let's go show them what warriors can do." Elena shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. This was as close to an apology as Kane could offer, and it was enough. Major Billings's voice cracked over the loudspeaker. "Team Alpha, you have 30 minutes on the clock beginning on my mark. Rules of engagement are active. 3 hits equal casualty status. Any team member reaching casualty status results in mission failure. Good luck." The countdown began. 10 seconds. Elena's breathing slowed, her vision sharpened, and the world contracted to tactical considerations. Entry points, fields of fire, time-distance calculations. The familiar pre-combat clarity that pushed away doubt and fear and left only purpose. 5 seconds. She looked at her team one last time, saw them ready, saw them focused, saw them waiting for her command. 3 seconds. The whistle blew and they moved. Cross broke away immediately, sprinting toward the water tower with his rifle slung across his back. He'd need 2 minutes to climb established position and get his rifle into play. They'd planned for that, built it into the timeline. Elena led the other 3 toward the eastern wall, moving fast, but not recklessly, rifles up and ready. The maintenance door was exactly where she remembered, a nondescript steel panel painted the same color as the wall. Kane posted security while Elena tested the handle, locked but not reinforced. Webb produced a breaching tool, a short pry bar designed for exactly this situation. 3 seconds of leverage, and the lock gave way with a metallic crack that echoed across the compound. They were in. The service stairwell was dark, cramped, industrial. Perfect for an ambush, terrible for a firefight. Elena went first, weapon up, moving smoothly up the stairs while Webb covered their rear. Kane and Brooks followed in tactical column, each covering different angles. First floor landing clear. Elena heard voices from inside the building, instructors playing hostile forces, waiting for the expected breach through the main entrance. Let them wait. Every second they focused on the wrong entry point was a second of advantage. Second floor landing, clear. Kane and Brooks split off here, taking position at the hallway entrance, preparing to establish their blocking force. Kane gave Elena a thumbs up. Ready, third floor landing. Elena paused, listening. Movement beyond the door, multiple footsteps, voices coordinating defensive positions. At least 4 defenders, maybe more. She pulled a training flashbang from her kit, primed it, and held up 3 fingers to Webb. 3-second countdown. 3, 2, 1. She opened the door just wide enough to toss the flashbang into the central hallway, then slammed it shut. The explosion was muffled by the walls, but still loud enough to rattle the doorframe. Through the crack, Elena watched. 4 doors along the hallway. 3 remained closed. One, the second on the left, opened immediately, and an instructor leaned out, weapon up, scanning for threats. Target room identified. Elena and Webb moved simultaneously, breaching through the stairwell door and sweeping into the hallway. The instructor at the target room spun toward them, got off two shots that went wide, and Webb's return fire caught him center mass. First kill. Two more instructors emerged from flanking rooms. Crossfire situation, exactly the nightmare scenario in a narrow hallway. Elena went low. Webb went high, and they moved forward aggressively, using speed to close the distance before the instructors could establish proper firing positions. Simunition rounds cracked through the air, orange paint splattering walls and floor. Elena took a hit to the shoulder first, of three allowed before casualty status. Webb took one to the leg. But they reached the target room doorway, and Elena tossed her second flashbang inside before the defenders could organize. The explosion disoriented everyone in the room. Elena followed the flashbang through the door, her rifle tracking for threats. Three instructors inside, all reeling from the blast. She engaged the nearest one, double-tap center mass. Webb took the second. The third managed to get his weapon up, fired twice, caught Elena in the chest. Second hit. One more and she was dead. But the instructor's focus on Elena meant he'd forgotten Webb, who put him down with a clean headshot. Training casualty officially out of the fight. The mannequin representing the high-value target sat in the corner, wearing an orange vest marked with reflective tape. Elena grabbed it, slung it over her shoulder like a fireman's carry, and keyed her radio. Package secured. Coming down. Kane's voice came back immediately, strained with effort. We're engaged. Multiple hostiles on two. Won't hold much longer. 60 seconds, Elena promised. Make it count. She and Webb moved back to the stairwell, the mannequin's weight awkward but manageable. As they descended, Elena heard the distinctive crack of simunition fire from the second-floor landing. Kane and Brooks were earning their pay, holding position against what sounded like half a dozen instructors trying to force the stairs. Flashbang. Kane's warning came just before the explosion. The instructors were using the same tactic Elena had employed, trying to dislodge the blocking force. But Kane had anticipated it, had pulled back just far enough to avoid the worst effects, then surged forward while the instructors were still advancing. Elena reached the second-floor landing to see Kane and Brooks in close-quarters combat, mixing rifle fire with hand-to-hand techniques, turning the narrow landing into a chaotic brawl that negated the instructor's numerical advantage. Go, Kane shouted, taking another hit but still fighting. We'll catch up. Elena and Webb kept moving, descending to the first floor. Through the window, she could see Cross on the water tower, his rifle tracking movement inside the building. As they emerged from the stairwell into the main warehouse floor, orange paint splattered the wall beside Elena's head, sniper fire from an instructor positioned in the overhead rafters. Cross's rifle cracked once from the water tower, and the instructor cursed, taking a hit to the shoulder. Suppressing fire, forcing the sniper to take cover. 20 meters to the exit. Elena ran the mannequin, bouncing awkwardly, Webb covering their retreat. More instructors were converging now, realizing the target was mobile, racing to intercept. 10 meters. Simunition rounds kicked up concrete, dust, orange paint everywhere. Elena took her third hit, right leg, and stumbled. Casualty status. Mission failure. Except Webb was there, grabbing the mannequin, pulling Elena to her feet, dragging her toward the exit while firing one-handed behind them. They burst through the door into sunlight and clean air, and the whistle blew. Mission complete. 15 minutes, 37 seconds. 4 team members still operational. 1 technical casualty target extracted successfully. Elena sat on the ground, breathing hard, her vest covered in orange paint, and looked up to see Kane and Brooks emerging from the building. Kane had taken 2 hits, still operational. Brooks had avoided damage entirely, his defensive position perfectly executed. They'd done it. Against prepared defenses, against superior numbers, against every tactical disadvantage, they'd succeeded. Cross descended from the water tower, jogging over to join them. The 5 of them sat in a loose circle covered in paint and sweat, and for a moment nobody spoke. They just breathed, processed, came down from the adrenaline high that followed combat, even training combat. General Dutton approached, his expression unreadable. The observation deck crowd was silent, waiting for his assessment. Sergeant Reeves, Dutton said formally, that was one of the most tactically creative operations I've witnessed in 40 years of service. Aggressive, well-coordinated, and executed with precision despite significant obstacles. He paused, looking at each team member in turn. You utilized individual strengths, anticipated defensive positions, and most importantly, you trusted each other. That's the foundation of any successful team. He turned to Kane. Lieutenant, you demonstrated the ability to subordinate ego to mission success. That's growth. That's maturity. That's what we need from our future leaders. Finally, back to Elena. The question was whether you could lead after Kandahar, whether you still had the judgment and confidence to make command decisions. I think we have our answer. Elena came to attention and saluted. Sir, I couldn't have done it without them. This was team success, not individual achievement. That's exactly what a leader says, Dutton replied, returning the salute, which is why you're being offered a position as co-director of Advanced Close Quarters Combat Training here at Fort Wexler. Permanent assignment starting next month. You'll work with Lieutenant Kane and his team to develop new protocols incorporating your techniques. The offer hung in the air like a gift and a challenge. A chance to rebuild, to teach, to turn 2 years of guilt and self-doubt into something productive. A chance to stop running from Kandahar and start honoring the memory of the operators she'd lost by making sure future warriors were better prepared. Elena looked at Kane, at Webb, at Cross, and Brooks. 4 men who'd gone from mockery to respect in 3 days, who'd learned that capability wasn't determined by gender, but by skill, experience, and will. 4 men who were now offering something rare and valuable partnership. I accept, sir. The crowd on the observation deck erupted in applause, genuine and sustained. But Elena barely heard it. She was looking at the sparrow patch on her vest, thinking about her father, about Kandahar, about the long road from 15-year-old girl to 35-year-old warrior. The weight was still there. The guilt, the memory, the name she carried. But Dutton was right that weight wasn't weakness. It was humanity. It was the price of leadership, the cost of caring enough to feel when things went wrong. She'd carry it forever, but now she'd carry it while building something better, teaching something valuable, honoring the dead by preparing the living. 3 months later, Elena stood in the newly renamed Dutton Reeves Center for Advanced Combat Training, watching a class of 30 recruits, 12 of them women, run through close quarters drills. Kane served as her assistant instructor, demonstrating techniques while she provided commentary and correction. The base had changed in subtle ways. The casual dismissal of women's capabilities had been replaced by cautious respect. Not universal, not complete, but present. A shift in culture that started with 79 seconds in a warehouse and grew into something larger. Webb approached during a training break carrying 2 bottles of water. He handed one to Elena and gestured toward the recruits. You see that girl on the left, Martinez? She's going to be better than all of us. Got that same instinct you have, that ability to read combat dynamics. Elena watched Martinez move through the drill, smooth, efficient, already incorporating corrections from earlier in the session. She needs work on her footwork, and she telegraphs her strikes. She's 19 years old and training for 3 weeks. You're judging her against your 20 years of experience. Webb smiled. Give her time. Give them all time. They'll get there. Kane jogged over, his face flushed from demonstrating a throw sequence. General Dutton's here. Wants to observe the afternoon session. They found Dutton on the observation deck watching the recruits with the keen eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime evaluating warriors. He nodded acknowledgement when Elena joined him, but didn't speak immediately, just watched. Finally, your father would be proud of you, of what you've built here. Elena thought about Captain James Reeves, about the patient man who'd taught her to shoot, who'd instilled in her the values of service and sacrifice, who died defending people who couldn't defend themselves. I hope so, sir. I know so, because I knew your father. We served together in the first Gulf War before you were born, and I saw the same thing in him that I see in you, the understanding that some things are worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth carrying the weight for. Dutton turned to face her. He didn't die in vain. Neither did your Kandahar operators. Because you learned from those losses, you grew from that pain, and now you're teaching others so they don't have to make the same mistakes. Below them, the recruits were running a new drill team movement through confined spaces, exactly the kind of scenario that had tested Elena 3 months ago. Martinez was leading her element, calling out clear commands, moving with confidence. She reminds me of you, Dutton said quietly. 20 years ago, 15 years old, picking up a rifle because someone had to, because the moment demanded it and you answered. She's better than I was at that age. Maybe, but she's learning from you, which means she's starting from a higher baseline. Dutton pulled something from his pocket, a second sparrow patch identical to the one Elena wore. I had this made for her. Figured when she's ready, when she's earned it, you could pass it along. Keep the tradition alive. Elena took the patch, feeling the weight of continuity of legacy of knowledge passed from generation to generation. This was what survival meant. Not just staying alive, but creating something that outlasted you, teaching lessons that would save lives you'd never meet, building a foundation for warriors who'd face threats you couldn't imagine. The afternoon session continued until 1800 hours, and when it finally ended, Elena found herself alone in the center, walking through the space where she'd proved herself 3 months ago. The warehouse was quiet, now empty of people, but full of memory. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. Fallujah, CIA, Kandahar, Fort Wexler. Each step necessary, each failure and success combining to create the person she'd become. Not perfect, still haunted, still carrying weight that would never fully lift, but whole, functional, capable of leading teaching building. Her radio crackled. Kane's voice. "We're heading to the mess hall. You coming?" Elena smiled, keyed the radio. "Be right there." She took one last look at the warehouse, at the space that had transformed her, from broken operator to instructor, from someone running from responsibility to someone embracing it. Then she turned and walked toward the door, toward her team, toward whatever came next. The sparrow patch over her heart caught the light as she moved the small bird seeming to take flight. Appropriate, because she was flying again, not away from her past, but forward into her future, carrying the weight, but not crushed by it. Behind her, the warehouse stood silent, a cathedral of lessons learned and battles fought. But ahead was everything that mattered: purpose, partnership, the chance to turn pain into preparation and loss into legacy. Elena Reeves had come home, not to a place, but to herself, to the warrior she'd always been, to the leader she was becoming. And in 79 seconds, 3 months ago, 4 Navy SEALs had learned what General Dutton had known for 20 years. Some birds are small and easy to overlook, but when they strike with precision, power, and absolute commitment. The sparrow had returned to Fort Wexler, and this time she was staying.